Today, we're going to be taking a look at something pretty unique.
Sure.
It's called the Peaceful Public License.
Interesting.
And we're going to go through kind of what it is, how it works, and
Mm,
and why it matters.
seems good.
So, I guess the first question is, have you ever heard of the PPL before?
I have heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
not something I've worked with extensively, but
Right.
I know the general gist.
Yeah, so for our listeners who might not know,
Yeah.
what exactly is the Peaceful Public License?
So it's kind of like a new type of license for creative work.
Okay.
We have these copyright licenses like Creative Commons
Right.
that let people freely use and share work. And this kind of takes it a step further.
Oh, okay.
It says, okay, we also want to make sure that work is being used
Yeah.
for good and not for things that could be harmful.
So it's not just about sharing, it's
Yeah.
also about
It's about the ethics of it.
the ethical implications.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's fascinating. I mean, we see so much these days about,
Mhm.
AI being used in ways that maybe weren't originally intended.
Oh, absolutely.
Or, people's art being used
Yeah.
in ways that they wouldn't necessarily approve of.
That's right. And this is a way for creators to kind of have a say in
Okay.
how their work impacts the world, even after they put it out there.
So it's kind of giving them more control.
Exactly.
Well,
You have
and
more control over how it's used.
how their work is used even after it's released.
Even after it's out there. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So the PPL have this focus on peaceful applications and
Right.
preventing harm, but how does it actually define what is harmful?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's such a
Right.
broad term, right?
Yeah.
So they actually get pretty specific about what those harmful uses might be.
Okay.
For example, they specifically prohibit using PPL licensed work
Okay.
for things like military applications, surveillance technologies,
Wow.
and anything that promotes discrimination.
So it's really taking a stance.
Yeah, it's very much taking a stance.
On certain types of uses.
Absolutely.
Okay. And that makes sense given the name Peaceful Public License.
Exactly.
It's right there in the name.
Yeah.
So let's say I'm a musician and I release a song under the PPL.
Okay.
Could someone use that song in a commercial for a weapon manufacturer?
No, they absolutely could not because that would be considered a military application,
Okay.
which is specifically prohibited under the PPL.
So it's pretty clear cut
It's very clear cut.
in those terms.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I was reading about the PPL and I saw that there are actually 3 different versions of the license.
That's right.
Can you explain a little bit about what those are and how they differ?
Yeah, absolutely. So they have the PPL the PPL community,
Okay.
and the PPL research.
Got it.
And so they kind of each have a different intended audience and a slightly different scope.
So let's break those down one by one.
Yeah.
Let's start with PPL Personal. What is that all about?
So PPL Personal is really for individuals who are using a work
Okay.
for their own personal learning or for personal projects.
So like if I wanted to use a PPL image on my personal blog,
Exactly.
that would be okay.
That would fall under PPL Personal.
Got it.
Yeah, so it's really for things that would kind of fall under fair use anyway,
Okay.
but it's just adding that extra layer of ethical consideration,
So it's kind of like fair use, but with an
ethical slant.
ethical conscience.
Yes,
Very
exactly.
cool. What about PPL Community then?
So PPL community is geared towards groups.
Okay.
So think community groups, educational organizations, nonprofits, anyone who's working towards a shared positive goal.
Okay.
They can use PPL works freely within their community,
Got it.
as long as they're sticking to those peaceful principles that we talked about.
So they still have to adhere to the same kind of ethical guidelines.
Exactly the same ethical guidelines.
Okay.
Yeah. So for example, imagine a group of teachers who want to develop a new curriculum
Mm-hmm.
on conflict resolution, and they're using PPL licensed educational materials
Okay.
to do so.
That would be a good example.
That would be a perfect example of PPL community.
Okay, cool. And then finally, we have PPL Research.
Yes.
I'm guessing that's aimed at researchers?
Yes, primarily researchers, and particularly researchers who are working in fields
Okay.
like AI, where the ethical implications are really significant.
Right, because there's a lot of debate right now
A
about
huge debate.
how AI should be used and
Absolutely.
the potential for harm.
Yeah, so the PPL research is a way for those researchers to say, we're committed to using our work responsibly and ethically and to being transparent about how we're doing our research.
So it's kind of like a pledge
Yeah, like a pledge.
to to use the research for good.
Exactly.
Okay, I think that makes sense for all three of those categories.
Yeah.
One thing that really struck me about the PPL is this emphasis on auditing. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and why it's important?
Yeah, so auditing is basically a way to make sure that the work that's being licensed
Okay.
under the PPL is actually being used in accordance with the license.
So it's kind of like a check and balance system?
Exactly, a check and balance.
Okay.
So they recommend getting work independently audited by organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation or the Center for Democracy and Technology.
So these are organizations that are already kind of known for their
Yeah, they're known for their
work in ethical tech?
work in ethical tech and digital rights.
Okay.
And so they can kind of come in and make sure that things are being used the way they're supposed to.
So it's not just enough to release something under the PPL.
Right.
You also have to be willing to have it audited
Ideally, yeah.
to make sure that it's actually being used ethically.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really interesting. So I have one final question about the PPL.
Okay.
How does it work with other types of licenses out there?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Like if I have something that's released under Creative Commons,
Yeah.
can I combine that with something that's under the PPL?
So the PPL is designed to be compatible with some Creative Commons licenses,
Okay.
particularly the non-commercial ones.
Uh-huh.
But the key thing is that the combined work still has to uphold the PPL's ethical standards.
Okay, so I can't just mix and match willy-nilly.
Right. You can't just mix and match if it means you're going to be
Understood.
violating the core values of the PPL.
So no using it for military purposes or anything like that.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So I guess the big question is,
Yeah.
what do you think about the PPL? Do you think it has the potential to really change?
It's a really fascinating development, I think. You know, it's one of those things that it might not become the standard overnight.
Yeah.
But I think even if it sparks these conversations about ethical creation and makes people think more carefully about, you know, not just how their work is shared, but how it's used, I think that's a really positive step.
I completely agree. I think it's really forcing us to think about
Yeah,
the impact of our work and
exactly.
how it can be used for good or for bad.
Yeah, and it gives creators more agency
Yeah.
in that process.
Okay, so for everyone listening out there, we've learned a lot about the PPL today. It's a really unique license. It has this focus on peaceful applications, preventing harm.
Yeah.
It has these 3 different versions, personal, community, research. And it has this really interesting auditing component. So I guess the question for you is, if you were creating something today, would you consider using the Peaceful Public License? And if so, why? I think it's a really important thing to think about. And we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.